Alright, so my name is Saber, and every time a new set comes out for Magic the Gathering, I like to do not a full set review because there are way better players than me that will give you all kinds of advice on what cards to play and what cards they have their eyes on that they're looking to build around for constructed events. That's not really what I do. What I do every time a new set's about to release is once the full spoiler is up, I pull all of the instants, flash spells, and wrath effects, including smaller wraths, things that can destroy large numbers of creatures, especially, or large numbers of other permanents if the format is based around like enchantment creatures or artifact creatures. And I look at all of them because I feel like whenever a new set comes out, the thing that I lose to most when a set is new that I don't lose to later on when the set has been out for a couple weeks are those spells. When you don't know what you're supposed to be playing around, that is the hardest thing to win a game of Magic, where you could have won if you had just known about these cards. So every time a new set comes out, I like to focus on those cards specifically and go over basically just what they are, how much they cost. Like, those are the most important things about them. Just knowing that they exist is usually enough. For newer players, I will talk about how to play around certain effects, and sometimes I will note rarities for the purposes of how likely you are to run into them in any given limited format. But we're going to get right to it, so let me pull up my list of every card that fits my criteria, because I've done these before freestyle, and that did not work out particularly well. So the very first one is Aang's Iceberg, which is white and 2 for an enchantment. It has flash. When it enters the battlefield, it exiles up to one other target non-land permanent until this enchantment leaves the battlefield. It also has water bending for 3, with the ability to sacrifice this enchantment, and if you do, scry 2. So, this is the typical O-ring effect with a few extra things attached to it. First of all, it has flash, which means it can be used as an instant speed removal spell. But it also has the water bending ability, which allows the player to pay either 3 generic mana, or 3 mana of any color, or tap untapped creatures, and I believe it's artifacts. Yes, artifacts and creatures to help pay for this cost, with each permanent tapped paying for 1 of that mana. So, if they use this as a protection effect, because that's what it is in the story, I have seen Avatar, unlike some of the other Universes Beyond sets where I don't actually know the source material particularly well. I have actually seen Avatar, so it's been a while, though. I'm not one of the people that was super into it, but I did think it was a good show and worth watching the first time through. So if I butcher any of the pronunciations, I apologize. But it is the idea that the character did this to himself and winds up, being temporarily protected until the iceberg gets broken apart and they find him inside of it. So the player casting this can exile their own card other than this enchantment, and then later on effectively sacrifice it to get their card back and scry 2. They can also sacrifice it if you're about to destroy it in order to get the scry anyway. But other than that, it's just an O-ring effect, so it functions like any other creature removal spell at instant speed. The next one up is Airbender's Reversal, which is one of the lesson subtype cards. So unlike Strixhaven, there are no learn cards in the set. So having the lesson cards in your sideboard doesn't actually do anything, but there are many cards in the set that care about the lesson subtype. So the cards that are lessons are relevant for those cards, in addition to whatever effects they're having. But because there's no way to tutor for them outside of the game, they actually have a much more reasonable power level than the lessons from Strixhaven had, which may throw players that are familiar with Strixhaven off a bit, because you are going to be getting effects that are actually relatively potent for their casting cost, whereas the lessons in Strixhaven, they were a free additional card that you got on top of the spell that you already paid for, so they had to kind of be watered down in order to balance that out. So Airbender's Reversal is a modal spell, so you choose one: destroy target attacking creature or airbend target creature you control. So the airbend keyword exiles whatever card type it says that it can hit, in this case a creature you control, and as long as that card remains exiled, its owner may cast it by paying 2 mana rather than its normal casting cost. So this allows you to either kill an attacking creature, which is an effect that we see almost all of the time in Magic anymore. If it's not killing an attacking creature, it's deal some amount of damage to an attacking creature, or it allows to hit blockers also in white. This variant can only hit attacking creatures. It comes with the added benefit that if you don't need to destroy an attacking creature, you can save one of your creatures from targeted removal. Notably, if a card gets hit by an airbending effect, it still has to follow its normal timing restrictions. And also, because this can hit a creature you control, this is very important, it only lets you cast the card that's exiled. It does not let you play it, which means if you have one of the lands that's been animated from the earthbending effect, and you target it with this, it will stay exiled forever. You cannot actually get it back. So I highly recommend that you don't do that, and that you don't make that play, even though it's technically legal, unless you're denying your opponent the secondary effects of their targeted removal spell on your land. And that's the only thing that you can do in that situation, and you need to deny them the effect. I forget what cards in this set kill a creature and do something else that aren't targeted, because it has to only have one target in order for it to fail. But there might be something in black or red, so just in case, keep that in mind. Like, if you have to fizzle the effect, that's fine, but don't try and save your mountain by airbending it away from the removal spell. That does not work. Also, the earthbending cards bring the land back if it leaves play anyway, so there's extra no reason to do that. So, for the newer players, when you're trying to play around removal spells that can only affect creatures that are doing a certain thing, in this case, they have to be specifically attacking, if this is the card you are worried about and you have good attacks without putting your best creatures in harm's way, then pressure your opponent that way first. As long as you're not missing out on lethal damage, if you have lethal damage most of the time, you're supposed to make them have it because they're going to need to use it anyway, and playing around it doesn't help there. But if you don't have to put your best creature in harm's way for this card and you can still pressure the opponent, you should probably do that. Only if this is the card specifically that you're worried about, or if you're worried about other combat tricks that would also kill your best creature. Making sure that that's not the one that's going to get killed by it, and that they will have to do something to one of your lesser creatures first, or just keep wasting their mana each turn, because leaving up a handful of mana each turn in order to cast a bunch of instants that are situational is a good way to waste the opponent's mana if you can avoid that situation or make it unpalatable for them to use these cards. It also comes up a lot with counterspells, especially the more expensive ones. And this is why you'll see more experienced players tend to run out their counterspells almost at the first opportunity, because they know that if they keep leaving up mana for the counterspells as the game drags on, they're wasting mana and denying themselves the ability to use other spells, or forcing them to choose between using the counterspell and using the other cards that they've drawn. So that comes up an awful lot in Limited. Next up is Airbending Lesson. There is one for each of the 4 elemental styles with this naming convention, and they all do something with their keyword mechanic. In this case, you airbend target non-land permanent and draw a card for white and 2. So, again, when you airbend something, if you airbend your own thing, you temporarily exile it and you can recast it for 2 mana and get its cast triggers and its ETBs You also get the Leaves Play effects, if it has any, for casting the spell in the first place. If you cast it on your opponent's permanent, as long as that permanent doesn't have flash, they will not be able to recast it until their main phase of their next turn, unless you airbend it during their main phase, which I don't recommend unless you really need to. There will be times if they're trying to get something like an aura or an equipment onto their creature, that will prevent it from being targeted by Airbending Lesson or make Airbending Lesson more expensive if it gives ward or anything. Then you might need to cast it main phase and just let them redeploy their creature, which is being recast, so unless it has haste, it will not be able to attack that turn either. But it is one of those more versatile cards because you can use it to save your own thing, or you can use it to temporarily remove the opponent's permanent from the battlefield. Also of note, and this will come up with certain cards, the 2 mana that you're paying for airbending is an alternate cost, which means if you cast a spell that normally has X in the mana cost, the player casting it will not be able to pay X because they are not casting it using its normal casting cost. They're using the alternate cost of 2, and that's the only thing giving them permission to cast the spell from exile. They can't choose to pay the normal cost instead of the 2. So this will stop a handful of cards that have effects based on what X is. There's one that makes allies. That's an enchantment, but it also buffs all creatures, so that's still mildly problematic when it comes back. But at least they won't be able to make a ton of creatures off of it. Also of note, there are a handful of cards with the waterbending mechanic that use it as an additional cost to cast the spell. Those still have to be paid. All additional costs must be paid. So if the spell is normally like 2 blue, but has as an additional cost to cast this Waterbend 5, I think, is one of the creatures that we'll see a little bit later, they still have to pay that 5 in order to cast the spell when it's required by the spell. Some of them will have, you may Waterbend an amount or may pay other costs. Those they can still pay, similar to kicker effects, but if it has a mandatory cost, they do have to pay it. So if you airbend something that normally has like that waterbending 5 attached to it, then they will still have to pay 7 mana, and they can waterbend up to 5 of it in order to reduce the casting cost by tapping their permanents. Next up is I think his name is Appa, not Appa, but if I'm butchering the names, I apologize. I watched it once when it was new and have not really seen it since. So I believe it's Appa. This is 2 white and 2 for a Bison ally, 3/4 with flash and flying. When Appa enters, airbend any number of other target non-land permanents you control, and whenever you cast a spell from exile, create a 1/1 white ally creature token. So, a couple things to note. First of all, there are several cards in the set that care when an ally enters the battlefield. So, an ally with flash, and there are several of them, can trigger those abilities at instant speed. So, very similar to sets with landfall, where you need to be aware when an opponent can potentially play a land at instant speed or put a land onto the battlefield at instant speed. For this set, you definitely have to be aware of what all of the what the cards that care about allies entering the battlefield can do, because they may be able to play multiple allies at instant speed. There's a creature that makes a 1/1 ally and is itself an ally with flash that we'll get to. So all of those cards, you need to take them into account, what they can potentially do if they have multiple flash allies or an ally that makes multiple other allies when it enters. So in that regard, Appa is potentially an additional trick in addition. Yeah, an additional trick in addition. Good job, me. To being able to save multiple cards. So again, this can airbend only your non-land permanents, so it will save things from target removal and wrath effects, because you'll be able to recast them later on, which is why Appa is a mythic in this instance. So it's also a 4-mana 3/4 flyer that they can flash out at instant speed, and anybody who knows Restoration Angel knows just how brutal a card like this can be. This thing can suddenly pop out of nowhere, eat flyers that are attacking in for, like 2 or 3 points of damage a lot of the time, and then be around to attack after that. And it can also give you value by exiling your stuff so that you can recast it and get enters the battlefield triggers again. So, Appa is incredibly powerful, definitely worthy of the mythic status, and just be aware of that. Not only that Appa can ambush your creatures, but also that it can trigger all of the opponent's allies' matter cards on top of that. So Appa does represent a potentially huge blowout in that regard. After Appa, so we come to our first pseudo Wrath. So this is Avatar's Wrath, which is not quite a normal Wrath, but it removes so many creatures from the battlefield temporarily that I have to consider it for this list. So 2 white and 2 sorcery. You choose up to 1 target creature, then airbend all other creatures. Until your next turn, your opponents can't cast spells from anywhere other than their hands, and you exile Avatar's Wrath. So this removes all of their creatures from the battlefield. You can leave up to 1 creature if you want to on their side, but you don't have to. And then they cannot recast those creatures for a turn cycle. So this not only takes all of their things off of the board, it stops them from redeploying them even if they had flash. Or from casting them on their next turn either. So at that point, it is basically a Wrath. But it can be very one-sided because you will be able to redeploy your creatures. Of note, because it can have up to 1 target, if that target leaves the battlefield before Avatar's Wrath resolves, the spell will be countered for having no valid targets. So if you do choose a target, be aware of that if your opponent can kill your creature, you will have the Wrath be countered. So take that into account. Don't just cast this when your opponent has a ton of mana available and has shown instant speed removal spells in previous games, because you don't want to lose your Wrath effect just because they killed the 1 creature. Because if the 1 creature goes away, then all of yours and all of theirs stay on the battlefield now, which can be incredibly problematic when you thought they were all about to leave and you were about to get your enters the battlefield triggers again. But past that, it is functionally a Wrath. It removes all of their creatures and keeps them gone for an entire turn cycle. So it's going to be very hard for the opponent to win a game where all of their creatures disappeared and all of yours got to get redeployed for 2 mana apiece. Especially since this is a 4-mana Wrath, so drawing this when you have, 6, 8, 10 mana means that you can redeploy multiple creatures potentially on the same turn that you cast it. So Avatar's Wrath is a very strong Wrath variant at 4 mana. A lot of Wraths nowadays actually cost 5 mana. So the fact that there is a 4-drop one, it is temporary, but it's usually going to be pretty fatal for the opponent if you manage to cast this thing. So get some water here. And then we go on to the other White Wrath in the set. Again, it leaves behind certain creatures. So Destined Confrontation is 2 white and 2 for a sorcery. Each player chooses any number of creatures they control with total power 4 or less, then sacrifices all other creatures they control. So each player is only going to get to keep either 1 medium-sized creature, a couple of little creatures, maybe 4 1/1s at most, and lose the rest of their board state. So this is particularly strong against green aggressive decks because they will probably only be able to keep 1 creature, or not their best creature at the very least. So, and as a white deck, you should be able to keep one of your better creatures, something with a strong ability and smaller stats, or possibly a group of smaller creatures, a couple of 1/1s and a 2/2 maybe. So, Confrontation isn't the strongest Wrath, but it's going to kill most likely your opponent's best creatures because they'll just be too big. So that will leave them with only the smaller creatures in play. Also, you are the one that knows it's coming, so you can craft a board state. A lot of times when your opponent has a Wrath, you will be able to figure out that they have it by certain actions that they take. Odd chump blocks when their life total is relatively high, passing the turn without casting anything. Usually, when an opponent passes on like turn 4 or 5 without casting anything, that's a red flag if there's a Wrath in their colors, because most players don't wind up with hands that can't do anything for multiple turns in the mid to late game. Like, that's usually not something that happens. Usually you are building towards, like, that one, 4 or 5 mana play, and then maybe you've run out of stuff if you're flooding out or something. So, for newer players, they might not realize how suspicious the opponent's actions are. It's like, oh, cool, I got them to chump block, or, oh, this is great, they don't have anything, somehow. And yes, every once in a while that will be true. A lot of the time, though, if they're in Wrath colors, they are setting up for the Wrath and trying not to lose certain things. This one can be a little bit more deceptive because certain creatures are definitely going to live. So the opponent can deploy a 4-power creature while planning to cast this with the idea that they will kill all of your stuff except for some combination of 4 power worth of creatures and just lose their little guys. So if you're going super wide, you'll wind up with only a small number of creatures, and they'll wind up with a big creature that holds off all of your stuff and can potentially dominate on the board before deploying more things because they knew not to play into their own Wrath. So, while it seems a lot weaker than a regular 4-mana Wrath, the fact that you have some amount of control over what you're going to be keeping and can guess what the opponent will be keeping gives you that extra layer of flexibility to the card. So, it is still a Wrath, you do still have to worry about it. Also, of note, it is an uncommon. This is a Wrath, so similar to, there was a pseudo-Wrath in original Ixalan block. Either Ixalan or Rivals. That did a similar thing where you totaled up the power of the creatures and then you got to keep, up to, I think it was 4 or 5 total power or something like that. So very similar to this. That was a rare, and it got reprinted as an uncommon in one of the master sets, I believe. So, kind of an interesting note that they've just jumped ahead and made it an uncommon this time. So you're going to see this one slightly more often than you normally would. So if you're a go-wide strategy, your opponent might just kill a huge number of your things while getting to keep their best guy. So take that into account when deciding if you need to deploy more creatures at any given point in time against a white deck. Next up is Enter the Avatar State. So this is a variant that we get in basically every set now also. This is the usually 1 to 2 mana white trick that protects a creature. In this case, a creature you control becomes an avatar in addition to its other types. It gains Flying, First Strike, Lifelink, and Hexproof, all until end of turn. So, Hexproof can protect it from targeted removal. First Strike can allow it to win a lot of combats that it wouldn't otherwise win. And Flying and Lifelink make it evasive and allow a dramatic shift in potential damage races, all for a single white mana. Now, a lot of times, these tricks don't play as well as I think they will, but they do have more and more play, I feel like, as sets keep getting more and more focused. A lot of the things that they've been doing lately have been to make these sets more viable for best of one. A lot of cards that used to be sideboard cards have multiple options on them to make them more palatable to have in the main deck, for example. And because the sets have gotten slightly smaller, they have taken away a lot of the more chaff cards that we used to get, or the more narrow cards. So, with everything being slightly more playable than it used to be, a lot of the creatures and creature removal see a lot more play than they normally would. Whereas you used to get like curve fillers that were very underwhelming, you know, actual bears like 2 mana 2/2s with no abilities and that sort of thing. Nowadays, you don't really get that, and you also don't get um like a ton of different removal. You just get a handful of very focused removal, like a thing that can kill a little creature, a thing that can kill any creature efficiently, and a thing that can kill any creature inefficiently are like your removal spells a lot of the time. So being able to blank a removal spell has been getting more and more relevant as the creatures have been getting better overall, and the draft formats have been relatively fast. So I always worry about cards like this as the blowout that's going to save my opponent because I can't kill their creature a second time. But they don't always play out particularly well, so I do like to note when one of these is in the set. So another thing that has become a lot more commonplace because of cards like this is if your opponent is tapped out, kill their creature with your instant speed removal spell on your own main phase. And that's not a joke. Like, actually kill their creature. If their creature is that much of a problem, and there are spells in this, and there are multiple spells in this set that can protect a creature from removal spells, including cards on the bonus sheet. So, do not let your opponent untap with something that will kill you if they get to keep it, because cards like this exist in the set, and you really don't need to wait until the last possible minute. That used to be a thing in Magic. Waiting until the last possible minute gave you the most options for your card and let you get the most information before making your decision. Nowadays, because of efficient creature protection, if something is that dire of a threat and they don't have mana available to protect it, kill the thing right then and there. It's become a lot more relevant in the past few years in Magic to do that because there are so many. There's always one card like this at least in the set, and sometimes there are multiples. So, and like I said, they've been getting better. They don't show up as often as I think they will, but they do show up more than they used to. So it used to require something like Snakeskin Veil, where it gave you the counter on top of that, or Royal Treatment, you know, where it left the aura behind. Nowadays, you can actually just get away with the 1 mana trick that saves the creature and doesn't give it any permanent buffs because it saves the creature, and removal spells are slightly more of a premium than they used to be. So if you can just keep your best thing alive through one removal spell, it might be too much for the opponent. You know, they had a removal spell, they were saving it for this problematic creature, and now it's still alive. So keep that in mind too when you're playing against cards like this. Don't let them untap because you want to try and get them. If the creature is that important to take off the battlefield, take it off the battlefield at the first opportunity when it's still vulnerable. You do not want to have your opponent spend 1 mana to negate your like 3 to 5 mana removal spell and keep their best creature. Also, the flip side to that is if you are running this card and you can wait a turn to get that extra mana in play so that way they cannot kill your creature, you should probably do that unless they are a blue heavy control deck where you have to worry about counter spells and they're currently tapped out, or tap too low to cast a meaningful counterspell on your creature. Uh, Try and deploy it when you have access to the mana to protect it also, if you're going to run cards like this. Alright, next up is Fancy Footwork. This is the type of card that people will play, first of all, because there are definitely go-wide strategies in this set. There are a lot of creatures, like I said, that aren't just allies, they make allies on top of that. So having 2 creatures in play is not that difficult. So this is white and 2 for an instant lesson. You untap up to 2 target creatures, and they each get +2/+2 until end of turn. So this is the type of card where a lot of people have the idea that they're going to get the opponent so good with it. They're going to spend 3 mana, untap 2 of their creatures, give those creatures +2/+2, and assign blockers, and just eat 2 of the opponent's creatures. And this is the thing that I am talking about when I say things that you will lose to in the first week that the set is out, that you won't lose to anywhere near as often later in the format, are cards like this. When your opponent is attacking into you with weaker creatures and you're like, okay, do I bait out the trick or do I take the damage here? If they don't do anything, it can be this card, and they might be trying to get you by eating 2 of your creatures since you didn't block properly for this thing to take advantage of it. So when there's a card that can pump a lot of creatures, like typically there are cards that will pump all of your creatures in this kind of casting cost range. This one happens to untap the creature, so it only affects 2 of them. The way that you play around cards like this when you're on the defense is you don't put your creatures so that they match up properly for the bonus. This is true when you know all of the bonuses your opponent can possibly apply from knowing all of the combat tricks in the set, but this is especially true of any mass pump effects. In this case, a +2/+2. So the ideal is to get your best creatures on something incredibly weak where they're not going to be able to kill it even with a pump spell in order to eat their smaller creatures, and to either multi-block so that way their pump spell doesn't get to kill both of your creatures, but you still kill theirs. As long as you can not take lethal damage from this thing by the way that you're blocking, like, take that into account first. If you can't let any creature through because +2/+2 to that creature will kill you, or 2 creatures getting through with an extra +4/+4 on top of that is going to get you killed, then you have to block everything. But you should always be blocking in a way that if they have cards like this, they don't get to just win combat entirely, and like you lose your best things and they keep their best things. Whenever you can, you want to try and block in such a way, like you want to put like 2 3/3s on a 2/2 if you can, so that way if it's suddenly a 4/4, they get to kill a 3/3, they still lose their guy, and that's the total benefit that they've gotten out of it, was that they got to kill your 3/3 with their 2/2 in a combat trick. And at that point, it basically mitigates all of the extra damage that they were going to do with a card like this. If they can't kill a bunch of your creatures and save their guys at the same time, they don't get the huge tempo blowout that these type of cards can generate. Similarly, attacking into them when they're representing a trick like this, you have to be careful so that way they still have to lose stuff in order to block your guys, and the stuff that you are losing to it isn't critical if you can help it. If you don't have any way on your own to protect your creature if they have something like this, for example. Yeah, you don't want to run your poor Sky Bison after he went through all the trouble of setting up an amazing turn before into their suddenly untapped 4/4 flyer that was a 2/2 until a second ago. But yeah, when you play around these cards, the best way to play around them is to make sure that even if your opponent has them, they're not that bad. The other thing that I always like to do with combat tricks, and the reason why I tend to get ruined by ones that leave behind permanent buffs, is if the opponent attacks early with the obvious intent that they're going to use a combat trick if you block, I tend to prefer if I can get them to use that combat trick in the early stages of the game, because the combat tricks get a lot better when you're saving your 3-3 or your 5-5 rather than saving your 1-1 or your 2-2. And they're a lot better when you're using them to kill an opponent's 5-5 rather than to win combat against, their 3-power creature. So the sooner I can get my opponent to use up their combat tricks in the early game, the better. With a card like this, what you probably want to do is like put 1/2/2 on one of their 2/2s and let the other one through, rather than blocking 2-power creatures on like one of each creature on one of each of theirs and letting them have this thing, because then they get to kill one of your guys and deal you 4 damage, but now they have 2/2s in play, and ideally you're going to deploy larger creatures after this, and now they don't have their cool combat trick to use against you. So that's the way I tend to play against all combat tricks, is to try and force it out. If anybody does anything in the early game that represents a trick like this, I want to make them use it as soon as possible, because the longer the game goes on, the more likely any combat trick is to save something of significantly greater value. Because there are times where you just look at your opponent's board and you go, yeah, I have to put all 3 of these on your 6/6 and hope you have nothing, because otherwise I'm just going to lose this game. And when they have it, it's awful. So anytime I can encourage them to use that type of card before we get into that situation, the better I feel like I'm doing. So that was Fancy Footwork. Next up is Invasion Reinforcements. It is down here. There it is. So this is the one I was talking about before. This is white and 1 for a human warrior ally 1/1 with flash. When it enters the battlefield, create a 1/1 white ally creature token. So this is 2 mana for 2 1/1s at instant speed, which is already an absurdly good rate. Resolute Reinforcements, instant speed, 2 mana cards that made 2 1/1 creature tokens. These are all things we've seen before in Limited, and they have always been strong. When you attach a relevant creature type that other cards are looking for, and that other cards positively affect, to that card, it gets even better. So this is already 2 mana for 2 power and 2 toughness worth of stats at instant speed, but anything that enhances a creature and anything that cares about an ally entering the battlefield will now have 2 more creatures to enhance and will get triggered twice respectively for those effects. So this is a very important one to be aware of, especially if your opponent has a board state where 2 creatures suddenly appearing on the battlefield that happen to be allies are going to absolutely wreck the numbers that you were working with up until that point. Like I said with Appa, a flash ally in this set is worth a lot more than it normally would be, in addition to already being a creature with flash, which is already a pretty strong play. This thing can ruin combat math, when they suddenly have 2 extra chump blockers, even without taking into account everything else they can do, or where 2 extra attackers appear during your end step, so that way the opponent will be able to now untap and have 2 non-summoning sick creatures in addition to everything else they had. So this thing is definitely one that you need to have in your headspace and be prepared for as the thing that's going to come out and ambush your guys. After that, the next card is Razor Rings. So we scroll down a bit. So similar to Airbender's Reversal before, where it can kill an attacking creature, this is one of the ones that deals 4 damage to an attacking or blocking creature. So this is one of the ones that can get a blocker also. It's 2 mana, which is pretty common for this type of effect. This one has the added benefit, though, if it deals excess damage to a creature, you gain life based on the excess damage. So if you use this to kill a 3 toughness creature, you will gain a life, because it dealt 4 damage, so the excess is 1. So these cards are already pretty decent as far as white removal goes. It kills small to medium attacking and blocking creatures, or helps you get the last few points of damage in on a larger creature. But it also has the added effect of life gain, which will throw off the math for aggressive decks, especially because now not only can they kill your smaller creature, they'll also gain life for killing it. So if all of your creatures are like 1/1s and 2/2s, killing a 2/2 and gaining 2 life effectively negates the attack of two different 2-power creatures. As far as your combat math goes, if you were about to kill the opponent with all of your attacking creatures, and you could afford to have them kill one of them and you would still win the game, now they killed one and negated another one, so now you don't win the game anymore. So that's something to take into account. Also, as a bit of advice for newer players, so this is one of those things that newer players tend to do a lot, is they'll block, they'll put their 2/2 on the opponent's 3/3 or something and cast, oh no, that doesn't work. They'll put like their 2/2 on like a 5/5 and cast Razor Rings immediately to deal the 4 damage to the creature. So not only is this bad to begin with, it's actually even worse for this particular card. So what you want to do is, assuming that your creature does not have first strike, in which case you just let first strike damage resolve and then deal the 4 damage to it to kill it with the first strike damage. If the two creatures are both going to hit each other, there is a end of combat step where creatures are still considered to be attacking and blocking creatures before you go to main phase 2. You might have to go into full control if you're playing on Arena to make sure that it doesn't pass through this step. But you have a time where the creature has been dealt the combat damage where you can cast this spell and it will still have a valid target. And you really, really want to do that with this one especially, because the damage already dealt to the creature counts towards determining whether or not the 4 damage is excess or not. So you can gain additional life if you're going to already 2-for-1 yourself. You might as well gain that extra life anyway. And also, if the opponent kills your creature in response to this and combat damage hasn't been dealt yet, you've now gotten 2-for-1 and haven't killed their creature. So at least this way you get to more consistently kill their creature. They actually have to have something that protects it from the targeted effect or the damage from the Razor Rings itself at that point, which we already saw a card that can do that in Enter the Avatar state, but at least you're not letting them kill your creature and keep their best guy and cancel out your removal spell all at the same time. You're forcing them to use a thing to protect their creature specifically instead. So just keep that in mind, that you can play that way. That does actually work. And then we'll move on to our next one, which is Sandbender's Storm. So this is 3 and a white for an instant. It destroys target creature with power 4 or greater, or you can Earthbend 3. In order to Earthbend, you target a land you control. That land becomes a base power and toughness 0/0 creature with haste. That's still a land. Then you put the counters on it. When that land dies or is exiled, you return it to the battlefield tapped. So this is either 4 mana, destroy a creature with 4 power or greater, or 4 mana, make a 3/3 creature. Notably, though, the creature will be tapped if you only have 4 mana to work with. So, especially on Arena, manually tap if you're going to have a specific land in mind that you want to have become the creature. So that way, like, Arena will try its best not to auto-tap you in order to not tap the thing that you're targeting. But sometimes it really desperately wants to leave up certain lands, and it will accidentally tap the land that you intended to put the counters on, so just be aware of that. It also tries to avoid tapping anything that will deal you damage, and Sunbaked Canyon and Tarnished Citadel are both on the bonus sheet, which are lands that can deal damage to you. So If you are running one of those, if you're a red-white aggro deck and you just happen to have gotten Sunbaked Canyon, and it's like, cool, a land that it deals me damage, but I can also sack it to draw a card later in the game when I don't need a land. And then you have this up, Arena will desperately try to not tap your Sunbaked Canyon and deal you the point of damage, even if that means that it will tap the land that you're putting the counters on. Also, as a fun side note, Sunbaked Canyon actually a decent creature or a decent land to put the counters on and make into a creature, because later on you can pay one and tap and sack it to draw a card and then put it back onto the battlefield tapped, so that way you can untap and one tap and sack it to draw a card again. It is the only one out of the cycle that is on the bonus sheet. So just take that into account when you're using this card. Play against this card, so killing a creature with power 4 or greater, it's a removal spell. You can't really play around that. Surprise 3/3 for 4 mana. Effectively 5 mana, though, because they need the land to be untapped. Is not anything that I'm super worried about, but it is something that I do need to be aware of, because suddenly having a 3/3 when I'm attacking with a bunch of 2/2s means I lost an extra guy and dealt 2 less points of damage, and that's going to throw off my numbers. So, I recommend keeping that in mind, although most of the time it's probably going to kill a big creature, but if you don't have big targets for it, you do need to know about this one, because they will just deploy an extra 3/3 instead. Grab some water while we scroll down to the next one. Alright. So, Team Avatar. 2 and a white effectively gives your creature exalted, like all of your creatures exalted. So when a creature you control attacks alone, it gets +X/+X until end of turn, where X is a number of creatures you control. So it's a very similar effect to Exalted without actually using the Exalted mechanic on there. But of note, it also has a second ability, and that's what gets it onto this list. So, for 2 and a white, and discarding this card from your hand, the card itself deals damage equal to the number of creatures you control to target creature. So, this is a modal card where the first side of it is a 3-mana enchantment that allows you to attack with one creature and have that creature be massively buffed by all of your other bodies in play. But also, it can be one of those white-based removal spells that deals damage based on the number of creatures that you have. So this is effectively like the channel cards from Kamigawa and Neon Dynasty, where you spend the mana, you discard the card from your hand, and you get the effect. It just doesn't have the ability word on it. So this is functionally a removal spell based on the number of creatures that you have. So that's one of those things that you do have to take into account, is that this can be a removal spell in the opponent's hand. And it's going to be based on the number of creatures that they have. So if they time it wrong, you can kill one of their creatures in response and reduce the amount of damage that this card can deal, because it doesn't get locked in until the spell is resolving. So killing their creatures will reduce the amount of damage. Also, removing them, like airbending them off of the table, will help with that too. But there's going to be times when you can't really get all of their creatures off the table enough so that this thing doesn't kill your guy. So be aware of that with utility creatures, or if the opponent has a large number of little bodies and you're about to deploy one of your big guys, that this is one of the things that can take it out, in addition to things like the iceberg that can just kill any creature anyway, and the other thing that can destroy a 4-power or higher creature. So this is yet another card that you have to worry about for your large body that you were hoping was going to stabilize the board state. And last card for white is Yip Yip, and it is the traditional 1 white mana. Target creature gets, in this case, +2/+2 until end of turn, and if that creature is an ally, it also gains flying until end of turn. So, white typically gets a small pump combat trick It's almost always 1 mana and gives the creature +2/+2 and something else. In this case, it gives an ally flying until end of turn. It is a lesson, so there's slightly more value. So all of the lessons have slightly more value, and you will see them slightly more often because there are a bunch of powerful cards that care if you have lessons in the graveyard, cast a lesson spell, or will let you do additional things with lesson cards. So cards like this that might have gotten passed over for better cards in your pool in other sets are going to show up a lot more in limited because of those cards. There is a lot of extra value to be had from lessons in the right builds. So, whereas you might have been able to dismiss a card like this as being an underpowered trick that most people don't run because it just is, in this format, there's too much extra value to be had just from it being a lesson in the first place for players to completely ignore running it. So you're going to encounter these cards slightly more often than normal. So be aware that there is not only a 1 mana +2/+2 trick, but it can also allow their creature to suddenly jump up in the air and swat your flyer down while it was attacking. So, or that they can suddenly launch one of their guys into the air to get in for extra damage if they have access to this card. So, take that into account when you're doing your damage race math, if you're going to have to worry about suddenly taking 2 more points in the air next turn, or suddenly having a creature in your way while you're trying to attack with all of your flyers, where it looked like the coast was clear. Alright, next up is blue. So, our first blue card is Accumulated Wisdom. It's 1 in a blue for an instant lesson. So, you look at the top 3 cards of your library, put one of those cards into your hand, and the rest on the bottom of your library in any order. You can put each of those cards into your hand instead if there are 3 or more lesson cards in your graveyard. So this is what I was talking about before. There are incentives for running cards just because they are lessons. So any lesson that is even remotely feasible will wind up in some of these decks. So you cannot count on the, oh, it's a mediocre combat trick that most people don't run to begin with, because there is a lot more incentive to run them. This is just a card draw spell. So a lot of the times, especially in blue, there will be instant speed card draw spells, and the only thing you really need to be aware of with them, because there's not a whole lot you can do to interact with them, so there are 2 things. The first one is, this is why your opponent is getting priority, and they're not interacting with any of your stuff, is because they have a card draw spell, or because they have this and something else, and they want to use the card draw spell instead. The other thing is that, as an instant that gives the opponent access to a resource, if they are holding up counter magic and you try to play around it by not putting your best spells at risk, or by not playing into the counter spell and just taking advantage of the current board state to waste their mana, like if you are already ahead on board and they're leaving up big chunks of mana and you're worried about things like the haiku that we'll see later on, and so you're playing around it, they can use a card draw spell or something else with flash or an instant at the end of your turn in order to not waste all of their mana and to give them something to do with that mana. So those are the only things to be aware of with card draw spells, is that, one, it's the thing that's giving them priority if they don't have anything or don't seem to have anything. This can be one of the reasons why they're getting priority. And B, if you're trying to waste their mana, this thing might be a way for them to use some of that mana to try and find more cards and more lands, so that way they can hold up their counter spell while adding to the board so that they don't fall too far behind. So real quick, this isn't relevant to our thing, but next to it is, so this is a 2 blue, 4/5 flying creature with Ward 2, but it has the additional cost of Water Bending 5. This is the one I was referring to when you airbend stuff. This one, it is an additional cost to cast the spell, so even if they only have to pay the 2, they still have to waterbend 5 also. And they can only waterbend the 5 mana on it, not the 2 mana from having been airbent. Airbent? Yep, nope. I don't care if that's proper terminology, that's what I'm calling it now. Once something has been hit with airbending, it's been airbent. Alright, so that is accumulated wisdom. And we get to go pretty deep until we get to our next relevant card, and that card is It'll Quench Ya. And it certainly will, because Quench was already a 1 in a blue instant that counter target spell unless its controller paid 2. So this will in fact quench you, in that it will counter target spell unless its controller pays 2. Again, it's a lesson card, so the thing about a card like this is it rapidly loses its power when the opponent can play off of curve or has spent all of their cards and is in top deck mode, because now they are less likely to be as mana efficient as possible and are more likely to have access to 2 extra mana to avoid the counter spell. So most players who play a card like this will try and counter the first spell at the first opportunity. So if your opponent is passing on 2 mana in blue, and you have the option to deploy your best 3-drop or a medium 2-drop, this might be the time to deploy the medium 2-drop, because if they have It'll Quench You, they really need to use it as soon as possible, because it gets a lot worse the longer a game drags on. The original card for this was Mana Leak, and that countered the spell unless they paid 3, and that stayed super relevant throughout a big chunk of the game, because 3 mana is an awful lot to leave up. Like, sometimes you will draw a really good spell and still only have 2 mana left over, even in the mid to late game. So Mana Leak had a lot more legs for 3 mana, which is why when they print these, they either make them more expensive or only let them counter the spell unless the caster pays 2, or in order to make it cost more, it has to meet certain requirements, like you have to have a creature with a specific thing in play, like a flyer for Lofty Denial or something like that. So a lot of the time, a player that has It'll Quench You in their deck, when they have access to it and they have the mana left up, they are going to cast it on basically anything that they can counter. So either you have to deploy the worst of your sorted threats first, so that way they have to counter that one, or you have to pass until you can pay the extra 2 for each spell that you're casting, so that they are leaving up 2 mana per turn to cast this card, or so that they have to tap out to play something of their own onto the board, so that way now you can cast your spells without having to worry about the counter spell at all. And you can go back to playing on curve until they start leaving the mana up for it again. But yeah, blue decks that don't have better 2-drop interactive spells are going to run this, because that's the option that they have. And when they do, they're going to have to cast it relatively early in the game. Otherwise, it's going to become a dead card pretty quickly in their hand. Alright, so that's It'll Quench Ya. Next up is Lost Days. There it is. So, this is another card that we see fairly often, but normally this effect is blue and 3, and it has a minor bit of upside. This one has a bit of a stronger upside, so it costs 5 mana instead. First of all, it's a lesson, so it already fills all of those requirements. So, the owner of target creature or enchantment chooses to either put it on the bottom of their library or second from the top, which means that if they choose to put it near the top of their library, there's going to be the top card of their deck. They have to pick that up without looking at it, put that card that you targeted with Lost Days on top of their deck, and then put the top card of their deck back down. So they have to draw one card before they can draw that card again if they want to redraw it. So, one of the things about cards that put them on the top or bottom is a lot of times they will just put it directly on the top, and there's not a whole lot of time before the opponent is going to draw that card again for the board state to undergo any kind of major upheavals. When it's the second one from the top, even if they have an effect that will let them draw it by their next turn, either like drawing a card now and then drawing that card on their turn, or drawing a card on their turn and realizing that it's a cantrip and being able to draw that other card, it might be a while before they can redeploy it because they have to spend mana to get to it, even if they can get to it immediately. So, the fact that it can take a turn or two for them to get back to the card and redeploy it means that the entire reason that they kept it might get thrown out of whack by the time they get back to the card. They do have the option to put it on the bottom if they think something like that's going to happen. So, because the older versions of these cards used to just put them on top, and that used to be an incredibly brutal play because you would put something on top of the opponent's deck that they would never want to redraw. Like, they weren't even thrilled that they had it to begin with, and now, but they played it out because, it's a body, and now it's back on top of their deck, and they have to waste a card draw on getting it back into their hand when they didn't want it anyway. So, Modern Magic, all of these cards are either to the top or bottom. But then this card has a little bit of extra beneficial text after the normal effect for a card like this. It also gives you a clue token. So it is 5 mana to either waste their mana and time redrawing this card, or to effectively kill it for 5 mana in blue, because putting it on the bottom of the deck is a lot of times the same as killing the card. And then you get to pay 2 mana later on and draw a card. So, this is one of the more brutal versions of this effect. Not only does it not give you the card back right away on your next draw step, but it lets the opponent draw a card later on also, and is a lesson for the cards that care about that. So, I would not be surprised to see this as like the top end or towards the top end of blue decks in the format, just because it will buy them time, remove problematic attackers or blockers, draw them a card, and count as a lesson. So, I do expect to see this one more often than you normally would for a 5 mana blue spell that's only doing the top or bottom of the opponent's deck for the card, as opposed to one of the ones that would lock down their creature for as long as it's in play. After Lost Days is Octopus Form. So this is another one where it's a variant on a card we've seen a few times before. So it's 1 blue for an instant speed lesson. Target creature you control gets +1/+1, hexproof until end of turn, and untap it. So we have the white card that grants hexproof. We have a blue card that grants hexproof, both for 1 mana. Seriously, if the thing is that much of a dire threat and they're tapped out, kill the thing on your main phase with your instant speed removal spell. You will not be disappointed when the opponent does not get to save their creature later on and has to save a worse creature using Octopus Form. You will be a little bit disappointed if they have to save a better creature later on, but you already had to deal with that other thing anyway, so you would have lost the game before you got to this point, so don't worry about it too much if they get to save their next dire threat. And again, this is the type of thing where if they're going to attack into me with like their 2/2 into my 2/2, it's like, no, by all means, save your guy in mid-combat by killing my 2/2 for 1 mana rather than saving your like 7 drop from my 5 mana removal spell. I would definitely prefer saving the 2/2 there. But I always try and get them to do their combat tricks early. Serpent of the Past, I almost missed this one because the flash is buried in here. So If there are 3 or more lesson cards in your graveyard, you may cast the spell as though it had flash. The spell costs 1 less to cast for each non-creature, non-land card in your graveyard. So this is what I'm talking about with lesson cards. Not only does this thing get cheaper for having the lessons in the graveyard, in addition to other cards that meet the requirements, if there are enough of them in the graveyard, it also has flash. This thing coming in out of nowhere to eat your 4/4 and still be alive to attack you on the next turn has got to be one of the more backbreaking flash creatures in the entire set. Like, Appa's probably a lot stronger overall, probably has a higher win percentage, which is why he's mythic. But this thing is still going to wreck a lot of people, especially if they can flash it in for, like, 4 mana, 3 mana, something like that. And that's not impossible. If you've ever played in, like, Dominaria United Limited, the Talarian Serpent that costs 1 less mana to cast for each instant and sorcery in your graveyard, that is an actual real dire threat, and that thing did not have flash. And that thing would come out way ahead of schedule. It got to the point where it was playable in Constructed for a while. So, I would not be surprised if this thing winds up winning a lot more games than it looks like it should for a 7 mana 6/5 with no evasion abilities. Next up is the Haiku that I warned you about. I feel like his name is Sokka, not Soka. So I'm going to go with Sokka, but again, it's been so long since I've watched it, I do not remember. So 3 blue, instant lesson, counter target spell, draw a card, then mill 3 cards, untap target land. First of all, just chef's kiss on the fact that the game text of this card is itself a haiku, in that it follows the 575 syllable pattern for haikus. It is a clunky counterspell, but it does draw you a card. It does rebate you 1 of the mana used to cast it. And the mill 3 cards is relevant for the decks that care about having enough cards in the graveyard, especially lesson cards specifically. That being said, it's not a particularly good card, and I would expect it to only show up in the decks that really care about lessons, or that have an aggressive early game and then just need a way to protect their things in the mid to late game. So this being able to stop something like Avatar's Wrath or the Fated Confrontation, whatever the other white card is, I think that's the name of it. Destined Confrontation, that's the name. I was close. Fated, Destined, basically the same thing. So that's the type of deck you are more likely to see this in. It also gets a bit stronger with certain other cards in the set. The one that immediately jumps to mind is there's a version of the uncle, the Firebender Prince's uncle, that lets you cast lessons from your graveyard, functionally for flashback on your turn for 1 mana of any color. Like 1 generic mana will cast any lesson from the graveyard. So having access to a counterspell on your turn for your opponent's stuff for 1 mana that draws you a card, untaps the land, and mills you 3 to put more cards in the graveyard to potentially fuel his ability is genuinely terrifying, but I believe he's a mythic, so you're not going to see that strategy very often. You're way more likely to see what I was talking about, where you deploy a handful of aggressive creatures early on, and then you use a card like this to stop board sweepers and other powerful effects from ruining your plan. I still don't think it's a good card, but it being a lesson and the fact that it's a cantrip can all come together to make it a lot better than it looks like it should be, so I would not be surprised if this thing sees a tiny bit of play because of that. Again, the best way to play around a card like this is to not play into it if you don't have to. Make them counter a bad spell if you can, or not counter anything if you're ahead on board, and just let them keep leaving up their 5 mana every turn until you can either deploy multiple threats in a turn, so that way they have to counter the first one, or just keep falling further behind on board, or make them have to actually spend their mana to start doing something first, so that way they can't hold up the haiku effectively for very long before they're just dead anyway. Alright. Fix my posture. Next up is Ty Lee, who is... There she is. So Ty Lee is 2 and a blue for a human performer ally. She's a 2/1. She has Flash, which gets her on the list. She has Prowess, so non-creature spells give her +1/+1 until end of turn. And when she enters, tap up to 1 target creature. It doesn't untap during its controller's untap step for as long as you control Ty Lee. So she just straight up locks down a creature. So she is a rare. You don't have to play against her very often. And she doesn't have great stats for blocking, especially since, getting her killed in combat will allow the creature that she targeted to untap. But she can come down during your end step, tap down one of your creatures and lock it down, and then be available to attack next turn. So that can be pretty brutal as far as combat math goes, where you suddenly don't have your best blocker and they have an additional attacker. Next up is the Unagi of Kyoshi Island. Kyoshi? I'm going with Kyoshi. I think that's the most likely pronunciation. So, 3 blue for a 5/5. It has Flash. It has Warder Bending 4, which means it has Ward 4, but the person paying the ward cost can tap their untapped creatures and artifacts in order to pay for it. And whenever an opponent draws their second card each turn, you draw 2 cards. So let's just take a moment to appreciate that this is a 5 mana 5/5 Flash. This thing just comes in and eats your creature. Your creature on the ground that was attacking is now very, very dead to this thing. And the Ward 4 means that it's going to be very hard for you to kill it at instant speed. The only thing that I can think of to give you any help in playing around this thing is keep in mind the Ward 4. If this is the thing that you are worried about, then when you attack, make sure that the combined creatures you and artifacts you have back, plus your mana, will allow you to cast your instant speed removal spell on this thing and pay the ward cost on it. If it suddenly were to spring out and eat one of your guys, otherwise your guy is just getting eaten. There's not a whole lot that can safely attack into this thing, and even the things that can are probably going to die in combat with it now, and wind up trading for it and maybe another creature if your thing is big enough. But even then, the fact that this thing just springs up and kills your thing mid-combat is kind of ridiculous. I'm actually genuinely surprised that it's a rare and not a mythic, because a lot of cards that are this big and have Flash normally come into play tapped anymore to stop them from being able to do this. So the fact that this one is only a rare is a little bit surprising, but it's just a giant sea serpent. It's going to come in out of nowhere and eat one of your guys if you're not prepared for it. So, and even if you are prepared for it, it's still going to be hard for it to not eat one of your guys. It's just, you might be aware of it and, be able to do the math. So it's like, okay, well, if they have this thing, it's the same thing as if they just have the 5 mana, put my best guy on the bottom of my deck. So, if the math still works out, the math still works out. And then immediately next to them, so we got 3 in a row, and they are rare, and mythic. So the mythic is Wan Shi Tong, I think. Wan Shi Tong Librarian. It is a giant owl spirit. 2 blue and X for a 1/1 bird spirit with flying. Flash and vigilance. So it has the flash mechanic. So the X in its casting cost determines how many 1/1 counters it enters, and also allows you to draw half X cards rounded down. So if X is 1, it's 3 mana for a 2/2 flying flash. But if X is 2, it's 4 mana for a 3/3 flying flash vigilance draw card. Um, and on top of all of this, whenever an opponent searches their library, you put a 1/1 counter on this thing and draw a card. Now, you may be thinking, for limited purposes, that's not going to come up too often, but anything that ramps land into play searches the deck. There are a few other cards that can search the deck for specific cards, so while this is more trinket text in limited than it will be in constructed, it's still not nothing. There are still cards that will let you search your deck for cards that the opponent might be running. So, Wan Shi Tong here might actually get an additional counter or two over the course of a game and possibly draw you a card, or stop the opponent from casting a spell because they don't really need extra lands right now, and they'd rather not buff your guy and give you a card for casting it. So this is a thing. So it's always going to be one less than the amount of mana they have available, but it's probably going to be exactly one less power and toughness than the amount of mana they have available, because, 2 blue and X, it starts as a 1/1 and gets X/1/1 counters. And on top of that, it's going to draw them a bunch of cards, and if it's big enough, it's going to eat your guy mid-combat, because why not? And the other option is it's just going to get flashed out at the end of your turn. They're going to draw a bunch of cards and untap with a grip full of cards and a giant angry flyer with vigilance. So, yeah, not at all surprised that Wan Shi is a mythic. There's a whole lot of value going on to this card. That moves us into black. None of the other cards meet my requirements. So, Azula Always Lies. Again, I'm assuming I'm pronouncing this one correctly, because there's not a whole lot of alternate pronunciations I can think of for her name. So, 1 in a black, instant lesson. Choose one or both. So this is one of my absolute favorite combat trick effects that they have ever done in Magic. I've loved this one since way back in the day with cards like Greel's Caress. I think it was Caress. It was a Greel named card from Prophecy, and I have always loved effects like this. So you choose one or both. Target creature gets -1/-1 until end of turn. Put a +1/+1 counter on target creature. So you get to shrink one creature, grow another one. So already this thing wins combats where creatures were evenly matched, or makes it a trade where the opposing creature was slightly larger. Like their 4/4 becomes a 3/3 and your 2/2 becomes a 3/3, and now it's a trade. But their 3/3 now loses combat to your 2/2. But also, this can allow you to win combat spaced across multiple creatures. So the same thing I said before about the 2 creatures get +2/+2 and making sure that your blocks are correct where this thing doesn't blow you out, also apply to this one, where if you put your 2/2/2s on their 2/2/2s, how many times can I say the number 2 in a row? This thing destroys you. Like, your one guy gets -1/-1 and gets eaten, and their guy on the other creature gets +1/+1 and now eats that creature also, and now they have a 3/3 and a 2/2 in play, and you have 2 dead creatures for 2 mana and 1 card. Which is why I've always loved cards like this, because people do not play around this effect as often as they should, and they get ambushed by it, and it's just so wonderful. So I'm going to tell you about this card now, and that way it'll be in the back of your head when you're at the pre-release, and you won't get absolutely ruined by it. You might still lose, because it will still kill your 1 toughness creature and buff their guy, and that might still be an issue for you. But at least you won't lose because you threw away 2 creatures to this effect. Also has the added bonus of the bonus to your creature is a counter, so it does stick around. So that is one of those things that kind of ruins me a little bit. Like I said before, the idea that their creature keeps the bonus is one of those things that when I try and force the combat tricks early, it winds up hurting me a little more because their creature is not only alive but better than it was. Still the type of card where I want to make sure it's gone as, as soon as possible so I don't have to worry that I'm going to get ruined by it later. Next up is Day of Black, not the Black Sun, it's Day of Black Sun. So this is X black black for a sorcery. Each creature with mana value X or less loses all abilities until end of turn. Destroy those creatures. So it destroys all creatures with mana value X or less, and it makes sure that they actually die by taking away all of their abilities. So indestructible and so on will not be factors when this thing starts killing them. Because it is modular, you can choose how much X is. As long as you have enough mana to spend on it, you can choose whatever number you want. So if your creatures are bigger than your opponent's creatures, you just kill all of their stuff and keep your biggest guys. If all of their creatures are bigger than yours, obviously you're going to want to get that X up to the casting cost of their biggest creature. But past that, like, as long as your creatures have the higher casting costs over their creatures, you will be able to most likely kill all of their creatures since you were able to cast your guys to begin with, and get to keep your best creatures in play. So this can very easily turn into a pseudo Plague Wind effect where you get to keep your best things. Usually tends to work best in green-black decks because of that. Because the green creatures will ramp you, and then the largest creatures will most likely be yours. And you should still have the mana to kill all of your opponent's stuff. So keep that in mind. Again, things I said before about playing around wraths and reading when they are going to happen. This is one where your opponent is incentivized to still play their largest threat out. Because they will be able to keep it and still kill all of your smaller creatures if you keep adding to the board. And them having a large creature out incentivizes you to play a bunch of little creatures so that you either have chump blocks while you are attacking them, or so that you can group block it and try and kill it in combat. So, again, one of those things you need to be aware this thing is a possibility, just so that way you don't lose to it all of the time. It's still a wrath effect, you can still lose to it fairly often, but if you know it's a potential card that's coming, at least then you don't have to. Also, if you can match their biggest creature by casting cost, then they will have to choose between killing all of their stuff and leaving you with your best creature also. So that's another thing to consider. Especially if they're not in black-white and you don't have to worry about the other thing just killing all of your guys because they have too high casting costs or power or whatever. It's too high power for the one thing. Or that they just all wander off and your opponent repeatedly punches you in the face after Avatar's Wrath. Alright, so next up is Fatal Fissure. So this is black and 1. Choose target creature. When that creature dies this turn, you Earthbend 4. So it is an instant. So what's going to happen with this card is your opponent is going to attack their 2/2 into your 2/2, hoping that you will block and trade, and they will get to turn one of their lands into a 4/4 for 2 mana in the early game. That is most likely what is going to happen with this card, where it's going to be any good, because otherwise it is a very clunky way to turn a creature into a 4/4. or turn a land, I'm sorry, into a 4/4, and that is not particularly good. This thing isn't a lesson either, so it's not as though it's going to get extra value from that. So yeah, that is all I have to say on this card. This one is one of the least impressive cards in the instant pile for me, but it's a new set. People are going to try it out, and the most likely use case for this card is getting your stuff into combat, or as an additional cost to cast one of your removal spells, paying black and one and discarding this card in order to turn one of your lands into a 4/4. And both of those sound medium, but it is an uncommon, so we're going to use. So this is one of those tricks that limited resources likes to bring up when trying to figure things out. Is Wizards puts cards at specific rarities because they have certain expectations for the card. So if the card is bad or narrow, but they want it in the set, usually it will wind up as a rare because it won't show up in packs that often, and when it is good, it'll be available to the person that wants it because nobody else wants that card. But on the other hand, if they make it, if they think it's going to be something that they want to show up like a lot and people are going to use it often, they'll put it at common usually. So if they think it's too good at common, they will bump it up to uncommon. And the fact that this is an uncommon makes me wonder how many games did people get into trouble because they blocked their 2/2 on the opponent's 2/2 and suddenly a land was a 4/4. Like, was that an issue? Did that come up often enough that they decided that this thing needed to be an uncommon? So I'll keep my eye on it, but it is the least impressive because it requires a bunch of other stuff going on for it to do its thing. It is worth noting, though, that they can also block your 2/2 if they have the mana available and turn their land into a 4/4 and then be able to presumably untap and start attacking with it. Not that the land was going to have summoning sickness anyway, because that's part of earthbending, is to give the land haste when it becomes a creature. Just to stop scenarios where you can't remember which of your 5 swamps on Arena was the one that you played this turn. Because much older cards had wording like that, so that if you weren't careful, you could accidentally target the land that came into play when using Magic Online or Magic Arena. Alright, so that is Fatal Fissure. Next up is Heartless Act. So this is a reprint from Ikoria. So 1 in a black, you choose one, destroy target creature that has no counters on it, or remove up to 3 counters from target creature. So this is your cheap kill anything creature spell. It can't quite kill anything because anything that has counters on it can only remove the counters. Of note, if you choose the first mode and target a creature that has no counters on it, you do run the risk of a card like Azula Always Lies or any of the other instant speed ways to put 1/1 counters on a creature happening and countering the spell because the target is now invalid. It has to be a creature with no counters on it when the spell is resolving also. And you don't get to just remove the counters instead. It's not... It would have to say, destroy target creature if it has no counters on it, otherwise remove up to 3 counters from that creature in order for it to function like that. But it's not. It's a modal spell, so once you choose that mode, you can't do the other mode instead just because it's suddenly no longer a valid target for it. So keep that one in mind, both when you're playing with it, that your opponent's instant speed cards that put counters on it can counter this spell, in addition to buffing the creature. Also of note, it can be any type of counter, so if there's something that puts any other type of counter on the creature. I think there's like one or two other counters. Like there's a rare creature that turns itself into Magus of the Moon by putting a special type of counter on itself with its activated ability. Just be aware of that. Like if they can get that fancy counter onto it, that will also work to save it. I forget how many different things can do that. Excuse me. But there are cards that can put counters onto things at instant speed. The one I'm thinking of is an activated ability of the card, so you'll know if they'll be able to do it, but that also means that you'll know if they're able to do it, so you might not be able to kill their creature if they're not activating it. You can kill it in response before the counter gets on it, if that's available to you, but otherwise you do have to worry about them being able to put a counter on it at instant speed. Which is yet another reason to just kill the creature if it's vulnerable, rather than run the risk. So that's Heartless Act. The next one is Rise of Sozin. There we go. So the Rise of Sozin is 4 black. Sozin. I don't know, do they pronounce it more like an E in the show? Am I remembering it? Is that why I thought it was Sozin? Instead of Sozin? Anyway, 4 black for a Saga enchantment. Chapter 1 is Destroy All Creatures, so it gets on this list because it's a Wrath. Chapter 2 is Choose a Card Name. Search target opponent's graveyard, hand, and library for up to 4 cards with that name and exile them. Then that player shuffles. And Chapter 3 is Exile this saga, then return it to the battlefield transformed under your control. It's part of a cycle of characters from the history of the show that are relevant to the plot at some point in time. And it transforms into a 5/5 menace with Firebending 5, which means when this creature attacks... I'm sorry, Firebending 3. It looked like a 5 at first, but I can see the 3 red mana symbols underneath it. It's the little fire symbol is curling up towards the number, and for some reason I thought it was a 5. Even though the fire symbol isn't quite there. Anyway, so Firebending 3, so when it attacks, you add 3 red mana, and that mana doesn't empty from your mana pool until the end of combat. And when it deals combat damage to a player, you can pay X, and when you do, you put any number of target creatures with total mana value X or less from that player's graveyard onto the battlefield under your control. So this thing is a savage beating, as would be expected from a Mythic and Limited. And Chapter 1 is Destroy All Creatures, so it's already a 6 mana Wrath before it does anything else. So it stabilizes the board pretty hard, and then goes and rips the opponent's deck apart for extra copies of anything, so if they got lucky and opened up, like 2 or 3 of the same card. This is a lot stronger in best of 3, where you'll have played against the opponent once or twice when you cast this, and you'll be able to know what to name. But even in best of 1, you just name something that's going to be a problem for you, and then go tear your opponent's deck apart looking for it. Next up is Ruinous Waterbending. So this is an infest type effect. It only kills smaller creatures, or if combat damage or other sources have already whittled away at their toughness, you might be able to kill larger creatures. So this is 2 black and 1 for a sorcery lesson. As an additional cost to cast this spell, you may waterbend 4. You don't have to. All creatures get -2/-2 until end of turn. If the additional waterbending cost was paid whenever a creature dies this turn, you gain 1 life. So this can be used either to kill all little creatures in play and shrink all larger creatures until end of turn, or this can be used as attack with a bunch of stuff, have the opponent block like big creatures on little creatures and eat them, with the idea that you're going to cast this post combat and kill the larger creatures that blocked. So we already looked at a bunch of other cards that care about attacking into larger creatures, where you can buff your stuff, like the +2/+2 to 2 creatures trick, and the Always Lies card to shrink one creature and grow another. This is yet another card that might be in the opponent's hand if they're in black, where they're attacking their smaller creatures into your bigger creatures, and you have to be aware that they can finish off anything that has only 2 of its toughness remaining. You know, if it's taken enough damage where it's alive by 2, this will finish it off if it's not indestructible. Of note, in order to kill a creature with indestructible, you have to give it total negative toughness equal to or greater than its toughness, so dealing damage to it and then giving it negative toughness to fall to 0 will not actually kill it, because it's only dead from the combination of lethal damage, which indestructible can't deal with, and the -X/-X. It needs to actually be enough negative toughness to kill the creature from full. So keep that in mind, that you won't be able to kill an indestructible creature that way if you're on the I'm going to attempt this side of the table. But other than that, it can kill basically anything that gets within range. So keep that in mind, and don't put your 5/5 on their 3/3 if you don't have to. Next up is Sold Out. It is black and 3 for an instant. Exile target creature. If that creature was dealt damage this turn, you get a clue token. Honestly, the if it was dealt damage feels like the most trinket text possible, because this allows you to basically chump block with like your 1/1 creature on their big guy before killing it, if you would like to trade your 1/1 for a clue token. Past that, this seems incredibly medium. So for that effect, like black and 3 kill a creature is perfectly serviceable at instant speed as a common, and this is probably one of black's best cards in the set because of that, like black's best common in the set because of that. But if that creature was dealt damage, make a clue token is the most trinket of trinket texts I think I've ever seen. So don't get distracted by that. It is still just a very efficient removal spell. Next up is last card in black is Zuko's Conviction. So it is 1 black for an instant, and it has Kicker 4. So you return target creature card from your graveyard to your hand. If this spell was kicked, instead put that card onto the battlefield tapped. So it is an instant speed Raise Dead, which is already pretty decent. Raise Dead is not incredibly good in limited, but it's not the worst, especially if you have a handful of really strong creatures that if the opponent kills one of them, the ability to get it back for a single mana is going to be a very dramatic reversal for the opponent, where you can now redeploy this dire threat that they had to spend a lot of time and energy killing. So Zuko's Conviction is already like borderline playable, potentially because of that. The fact that it is also 5 mana to zombify the creature at instant speed. Now, granted, the creature will come into play tapped, which is what I was talking about before with the Unagi, where the idea that it comes into play untapped is kind of ridiculous in modern Magic. So this one will come into play tapped, but that will also mean it will come into play at end of turn or in the middle of combat for its enters the battlefield trigger to happen. And then after that will continue to be a problem for you, because now they will be able to untap on their turn, and this creature will have been in play, and they will be able to attack with it immediately. So just keep that in mind. For this card is that they might suddenly have an extra attacker that they can have swinging at you next turn, and it will be the best thing in their graveyard. Okay, losing my voice a little bit, but that's alright. So, our first red card is Combustion Technique. So, this is 1 in a red. Combustion Technique deals 2 damage, plus the number of lesson cards in your graveyard to target creature, and if that creature would die this turn, exile it instead. It is a lesson itself, but of note, it will still be on the stack when determining how much damage it deals, so it will not count will not count as a lesson in your graveyard itself. This is yet another, the more lessons you have, the better the card is, because if you've cast any before this, it increases the size of the creature this thing can efficiently kill. So, at 2 damage for 2 mana, it's a little below rate. Once you get it to 3 damage for 2 mana, it becomes about on par with what you would expect to get for 2 mana. So if you can get it up to 4 damage or more, it becomes a very efficient red removal spell. So this is one of those cards I was talking about where the more lessons you have, the better it is, to the point where you might play 1 or 2 suboptimal lessons just to increase the effectiveness of this card, as long as you can take advantage of the lessons themselves. Sorry, I tried muting to clear my throat and cough, but I'm gonna be a little bit raspy for the rest of this, and I do apologize for that. But I need to get this thing out as soon as possible because the entire list is up, and we want to get there so that people can take their time to watch this before everybody else gets their things out. Because there will be a lot of other useful pre-release prep videos going on. Like I said, people that know Magic much better than I do, that will be able to evaluate the cards even faster and more efficiently without having played with them yet. I really need to play with them in order to evaluate just how good they are. Our next instant is Cunning Maneuver. So 1 in a red for an instant. Target creature gets +3/+1 until end of turn, and you get a clue token. So +3/+1 doesn't win a ton of combats, but it can actually win a combat because it gives additional toughness. So creatures that are evenly matched, it can save the guy, and creatures that are unevenly matched, it can allow you to 2-for-1 in order to kill the bigger creature. So, and it is also 3 damage is a decent amount of additional damage to pile on, and while that's not great to have spent a card to do that, the fact that you also get a clue token means that you will at least not have fully wasted a card on dealing 3 extra damage. Because a lot of times, if I'm at 20 and you attack me and you cast this, and I take 5 damage instead of 2, and you're down an extra card, I'm like, deal, sold. I'm glad I paid 3 life to make you discard this card. The fact that later on you're going to get that card back and have still dealt me an extra 3 damage is a little bit more concerning for me. So, the fact that this one isn't a lesson, though, actually really hurts it, I think. Like, the other one being +2/+2 and being a lesson, I think makes it a lot stronger in this format. It still does get you a card back eventually, though, so you will still see people playing with this thing, especially if they need a few more instants and sorceries for prowess triggers, as things they can do with their firebending mana in order to pile on some extra damage. You know, if you not only get to play this, but crack the clue token in the same turn because you have floating mana from firebending, that will also be helpful to make this card a lot more palatable. But this is one of the ones that I'm not expecting to see a ton of, but I will see it from time to time. And I think that's going to be the spot where it shines the most, is in a firebending deck where you might be able to crack the clue with floating mana that you have, or at least have cast this with the floating mana, so that way you're being as mana efficient as possible. Next up is Fated Firepower. So this is a mythic enchantment. It is triple red and X and has flash. It enters the battlefield with X counters on it, And if a source you control would deal damage to an opponent or a permanent an opponent controls, it deals that much damage plus an amount of extra damage equal to the number of fire counters on this enchantment instead of the damage it would have dealt normally. So at 4 mana, it makes all of your sources deal an extra point of damage now out of nowhere, and then an extra point of damage on all future instances of, combat happening, spells being cast, anything that's dealing damage at that point. And then for each additional mana past that, it increases the damage by 1. So this can be a very brutal overrun type effect where you attack with everything and the opponent assigns blockers as best they can, and then you flash this thing in with like 2 counters on it, and now all the damage that they and their things are taking are now 2 higher than they were. So it can deal a lot of extra damage that way. End of the day, it's a little bit less impressive than similar cards for the same casting cost have been, but it's the one that's in the set, so it does take a strong commitment to red, but notably the firebenders, if you can generate enough red mana by attacking with a lot of them, this thing will suddenly add a preposterous amount of damage to the board. So that's the part where that one gets really scary, is when they have a handful of actual firebenders in play and they get to get all this extra red mana in order to cast this thing and have X be like 3 or 4. Once X gets above 2, it actually becomes pretty dire. Like, 2 is already kind of scary, but anything past that makes this thing really problematic, and having it suddenly appear on the battlefield with that much extra damage is going to end a lot of games if it can be cast. It's going to be one of those cards that if you can cast it, if you have your deck built around it, it's going to be a build around A, I think. But you need to build around it. It needs to be able to finish the opponents off. Because otherwise you're going to fall behind, and then you won't be able to attack safely with your creatures, and then you won't be able to generate the extra red mana, and so you won't be able to get X anywhere near high enough to actually be relevant as you fall further and further behind. So it does really need to be in the right deck. But I think if you are in the right deck, it's going to be the thing that kills the opponent every time you cast it, so. Next up is Fire Nation attacks. So, 4 and a red. Also keep in mind, like I said, I'm not good at card evaluations in sets I haven't played with. So, my assessment of how good that card is might actually be wrong. Like, it might be too much of a win more card. It feels like the type of card where if you are generating a bunch of extra mana, you're going to win the game, but what if you're not generating all that extra mana, then casting it really doesn't do a whole lot. Like I said, if you cast it for like X's 1 or X's 2, it's not that impressive even at instant speed when you're on the offense, so you really need to be putting a ton of extra mana into this card. So yeah, take what I say as far as card evaluations with a grain of salt. I'm going to probably draft around it once if I get it at least, assuming that it's not the best card in the set. I am making that assumption because you need to be ahead and attacking, and it will finish the game in your favor very, very immediately. But anyway, let's move on to the next card. So 4 and a red for an instant. Create 2/2/2 red soldier creature tokens with Firebending 1, which means when this creature attacks, you add a red mana, and that red mana stays in your mana pool until the end of combat. It also has flashback for what looks like 8 and a red, so 9 mana total. Notably, it is an instant, so if you are attacking with those two 2/2/2s with Fire Breathing 1, that is 2 extra red mana in your mana pool. So you go from having 5 to having 7 just by having those 2 in play. So assuming that they live, you should be able to cast this on a subsequent turn to get those other 2 creatures out. If you're not attacking with those creatures or any of your other firebenders, the 9 mana is pretty prohibitive, but if the game drags on, you're still going to be glad that you have the option to flash this back and make 2 more bodies, rather than do nothing on the turn where you drew your 9th land. I do expect this one to see some amount of play. 5 mana for 2/2/2s at instant speed is going to be a factor, either because it's a 4/4 effectively with flash to block creatures with, or it's 2/2/2s with fire breathing that can attack, in addition to all the rest of your creatures that you played out on your opponent's end step. And both of those can be very strong when you're in a tight race. And having more firebenders means having more options. Like, anything that is instant speed gets a boost in red because of the firebending. Because you will be able to cast it entirely from the firebending mana. Whereas a black spell with firebending, is still adding red mana to your mana pool. It doesn't add black mana instead. So, because of that, you will be able to cast red spells definitely, but anything else, you will only be able to pay the generic costs on them, and you'll have to find the rest of the mana yourself. Which is still going to be a factor. It still lets you be more efficient with your mana by reducing the amount of generic mana you have to pay by however much firebending you have going on. So these guys producing extra red mana is going to be relevant if you can be attacking with them. I mean, it changes everything when you cast this card. Okay, I'm done now. But we'll move on. Alright, oops. How did we accidentally scroll back up that much? Next up is Firebending Lesson. There it is. So, this is a 1 red instant lesson with kicker of 4. Firebending Lesson deals 2 damage to target creature. If this spell was kicked, it deals 5 damage to that creature instead. So, Firebending Lesson is basically Shiv on Fire. I forget if Shiv on Fire could hit Planeswalkers. If it can, then there are slightly better option. Like, these two are not as interchangeable as I would think. Where Firebending Lesson is the primarily superior card. Like, the corner cases where dealing 1 less damage would be better are so few and far between as to be negligible. But it is 1 red to deal 2 damage, or 5 mana to deal 5 damage to a creature, and both of those are really good, and the flexibility to be able to choose which one of those this is probably Red's best card, honestly. Red deal 2 damage or 5 mana deal 5 damage is going to be the removal spell that you need on both points of the curve in order to deal with whatever the problem is. So, you will be seeing this one a lot. It's also a lesson, which means it instantly slots into any deck that wants lessons. Yeah, this thing is absurd, and I have to imagine if it's not Red's best card by the end of the format, it's going to be in Red's, like, if it should be Red's best common. If it's not, it's going to be like the second or third best common in the set, and congratulations to the cards that are better than it, because that's impressive. Next up is How to Start a Riot. So, since we're going to demonstrate how to start a riot, it is a lesson. It is 2 and a red for an instant lesson. Target creature gains menace until end of turn, and creatures target player controls get +2/+0 until end of turn. So notably, this one has 2 targets, so if the creature that the opponent is trying to give menace to suddenly wanders off, their creatures will still get +2/+0, assuming they targeted themselves with the other effect. So, you can't fizzle this one the way you could with Avatar's Wrath. This one's a bit weird because the +2/+0 is better to ambush with, but the menace you want to have on the creature already to make it hard to block. So, if this one is a combat trick, as opposed to I'm going to try and force my guy and as much damage through as possible by giving one of their creatures menace. Um, then what's going to happen is you have to treat this as 2 and a red. Their creatures get +2/+0 until end of turn, and you play around that the same way you played around the +2/+0 and untap things and all of these similar effects, where you don't put um like your 5/5 on their 3/3 if you can put your 5/5 on their 2/2 and throw something else on their 3/3 and trade, especially since this doesn't grant additional toughness. You don't have to worry about their things surviving the combat. You have to worry about your things surviving the combat. So just take all of those numbers into account and try to make sure that as many of your guys survive as possible without leaving you dead on board to the extra 2 damage per creature that gets through or that might trample over. Alright, so I believe his name is pronounced Iro. Iro's demonstration is 1 and a red for a sorcery speed lesson. So it has 2 modes, and you choose one. The first is it deals 1 damage to each creature your opponents control, or it deals 4 damage to target creature. So the 4 damage to target creature is not relevant to this discussion, but there are a lot of things that make 1/1 ally tokens in this set. So there are a lot of random 1 toughness creatures running around naturally, and there are also, of course, creatures that just have printed 1 toughness. And this thing can also add an additional point of damage to each one of your creatures, say, post-combat after your opponent is attacked with a bunch of things. So keep that in mind, that if your creatures are alive by 1, this might finish them off. And if your best creature is alive by more than 1, they might finish it off with the 4 damage effect instead. But that might leave some of your other things alive that would have died to the 1 damage, so depending on the situation. Just keep in mind that there is a spell that will deal 1 damage to each of your creatures in red, so much like everything else, if you can afford to, don't get your guys within range of it if you don't need to. Alright, next up is... Alright, let's actually look at the name of this thing. The Last Agni Kai. Again, might be butchering the name on it. This is 1 and a red for an instant. This is not a lesson, so... target creature you control fights target creature an opponent controls. If the creature the opponent controls is dealt excess damage this way, you add that amount of red mana to your mana pool. Until end of turn, you don't lose unspent red mana as steps and phases end. So this is a straight up fight between 2 creatures. So if the creatures are the same size, or if death touch is involved, then most likely both creatures are going to die anyway. So it's only relevant if the opponent has a creature big enough to kill yours. But notably, if they have one big enough to kill yours, that also means that it is probably dealing excess damage. It's way more likely that it's their 4/4 punching out your 3/3 rather than their 3/4 punching out your 3/3 in a lot of situations. So this can then give them extra mana to work with, not only to cast additional spells this turn, but also notice that it's not just the mana from this card, it's unspent red mana doesn't empty. So all of their firebenders that can attack can now have their mana make it to main phase 2 for casting creatures and sorceries and whatnot, instead of having to be used for instant speed effects in the middle of combat. So anybody that is running this is probably running it because it's a removal spell, like they have decent sized creatures and they think they're just going to win combats anyway. So they're just going to punch your guy out and move on. But they might also be planning on not only punching out your guy, but hoping that this also enables a decent attack with their creatures, and then that they'll be able to use that red mana to get even further ahead on board. After that thing is Lightning Strike, which is a reprint. If the Firebending Lesson is not the best red card in the set at common, this is probably it. 2 mana, deal 3 damage to any target, means it can also go face and finish opponents off, so keep that in mind when your life total is starting to get low, that if you go to 3 against a red deck, Lightning Strike is in the set and a common, and you might just explode from that. So that is a very real possibility in this set. A lot of modern red burn does not go to face anymore because of things like this. So just keep in mind that your life total is not as safe as it looks like it should be against a mono red deck or a heavy red deck. They might have a Lightning Strike or two. Even if they're just splashing red, Lightning Strike is a card I'd splash for, so. Alright, next up is Redirect Lightning. So, if Lightning Strike has got you down, here is your card. So, 1 red, instant, lesson. As an additional cost to cast this spell, either pay 5 life or 2 additional mana. Change the target of target spell or ability with a single target. So, this type of effect can be incredibly brutal or nearly useless depending on the situation. When you redirect your opponent's removal spell from your best creature to their best creature, and it can actually kill their best creature, if it's a burn-based spell and their creature is in range of it, this feels absolutely amazing. This will be one of the strongest cards you can possibly have. If you are redirecting something less impressive away, it's going to be alright. And notably, the spell can only have 1 target. So the thing that gives a creature menace and gives all of the players' creatures +2/+0 has 2 targets. So you cannot redirect it. Also, it's not up to 1 creature with menace, so you cannot redirect that away from them either. You can redirect which creature gets spared from Avatar's Wrath, which is kind of funny. But it doesn't stop all of the other creatures from wandering off. So that can still be a factor. Like I said, if you ever cast this and you change your opponent's, black and 3 kill a creature from your best guy to their best guy, it's going to feel like you can't lose the game. But the rest of the time, it's going to be, I kind of messed up your combat trick a little bit, so I got a 1-for-1 off of that. And it's a different 1-for-1 than you were expecting, or a 2-for-1 now, technically. So it's still a good card, and it is a rare. This is the type of card that sees, Imp's Mischief sees a lot of play in Commander. The Deflecting SWAT, but that one is free, sees a lot of play in Commander. This one being only a single red mana and 5 life, or red and 2. It's probably going to be a Commander card. I'm probably going to be considering it in a lot of my mono red decks, but for the purposes of limited, like I said, if you can redirect your opponent's removal spell, it's going to feel amazing. If they're just beating you down with creatures and there's nothing for you to redirect, it's a dead card in your hand and it's going to feel awful. So, just something to keep in mind. Also, if your opponent is losing, don't kill their creature. If they're not going to win this game anyway with their 1 blocking creature, maybe don't kill it and have your spell get redirected to your best guy, and now you're even further behind on board, and you're not going to kill them this turn, definitely. And you might not even have a good attack anymore because your biggest guy just wandered off. If you need to kill their guy in order to have lethal damage, probably consider it, but, don't kill their guy to demoralize them before attacking with everything. If they're holding up red mana, because this is the worst case scenario in that situation. Next up is Solstice Revelations. This is effectively a red card draw spell, so two in a red, exile cards from the top of your library until you exile a non-land card. You may cast that card without paying its mana cost if the spell's mana value is less than the number of mountains you control. If you don't cast that red card this way, put it into your hand. You don't cast that card this way, sorry, it doesn't have to be a red card. And it flashes back for red and 6. Again, with Firebending, you might be able to cast it in the middle of combat for the red and 6 a lot easier than it looks like you should be able to. But it's red and 2 for potentially a free spell, and if not a free spell, then a free card draw. So it's a red card draw spell. And everything I said about the blue cards applies to that, except that the red cards aren't likely holding up counter spells, but with cards like Redirect Lightning, maybe they technically are, so. Next up is Twin Blades. So, 2 in a red, it's an artifact equipment with flash. When it enters the battlefield attached to target creature you control, that creature gains double strike until end of turn. It gives the equipped creature +1/+1. So, it's a double strike trick. It will buff the creature. This is one of those ones where I feel bad because it buffs the creature and it sticks around. Fortunately, the creature can only gain double strike until end of turn, so you don't have to worry that they have a giant angry double striker for the rest of the game. But it still feels a bit brutal when they get to keep the +1/+1 value and the equipment can be moved around later to their other bigger creatures if need be. So it still does help to get this out of their hand, though, so that way their big trampling creature doesn't suddenly gain double strike in the middle of combat later on in the game. But it's a lot of mana as far as combat tricks go, so it's probably going to eat up most of their turn to cast it anyway. So again, it's more one of those things you have to know it exists, so that way you don't suddenly get killed by letting the 5 power creature through while you're at 10, because you think you're just going to trade blows with them. You have to at least consider that this card exists. And maybe you don't take 10 damage in one turn, or, more reasonably 6 damage or something. That's true. If it's their 4/4 and you're at 10, and you're thinking, it's like, yeah, I can go to 6 and keep racing, and you suddenly take 10 damage out of nowhere, you're going to feel real bad if you didn't at least consider this card. Alright, that was the last red card that meets my criteria. That brings us to green. So, first up is Allies at Last. This is 2 in a green. It has affinity for allies, so it costs 1 less to cast for each ally you control. Up to 2 target creatures you control each deal damage equal to their power to target creature an opponent controls. So, this is a typical green removal spell in that it's a bite, where their creature deals damage to yours and yours does not get to deal damage back to them. It can get down to a single green mana to cast at instant speed, and it can have 2 different creatures biting your guy, which stops them from the blowouts of you killing their one creature, and now their removal spell doesn't work and they got 2 for 1 if both of their creatures can punch out your guy by themselves. So take all of that into account when dealing with this card, is that it can be a 1 mana trick. If their guys are big enough, killing one of their guys doesn't matter, so a lot of times that's just going to amount to a very efficient removal spell, which is why it's an uncommon. Next up is Cycle of Renewal. This is 2 in a green for a lesson at instant speed. Sacrifice a land, search your library for up to 2 basic lands, put them onto the battlefield top, then shuffle. This is the Dominaria, I think it was Dominaria, but it might have been Dominaria Remastered version of Harrow, where it still gets the 2 lands and puts them into play, but it puts them into play tapped, so you don't get the rebate of the mana. You tap a forest and 2 lands, sack the forest, search your deck for 2 lands that are now untapped, so effectively you are up a land and did not spend more than 1 mana on the card, because you have access to the 2 mana again. So this one puts them into play tapped. Obviously, it's not going to affect combat or the board. It will change what your opponent can do on subsequent turns by giving them like one extra mana to work with and having fixed their colors. But past that, it's not really a factor for, you know, worrying about what they can and can't do to stop you from winning the game or to suddenly allow them to win the game. Next up is Elemental Teachings. So this is another one that just gets land. It's green and 4 for an instant speed lesson. You search your library for 4 land cards with different names and reveal them. An opponent chooses 2 to go to your graveyard, and you put the other 2 onto the battlefield tap, then shuffle. So it's not great for fixing if you don't have a bunch of different named lands that can fix your mana as far as splashes go. And it's not great for decks that don't need fixing because you probably only have 2 or 3 lands with different names in the deck anyway. Your 2 colors and your like comes into play tapped fixes your mana land from the common cycle. It is a rare. It's meant more for constructed than anything else, but it's something that your opponent might have, and that's why they keep getting priority. Next up is Origins of Metal Bending. This is 1 in a green for an instant speed lesson. You choose 1, it destroys target artifact or enchantment, or you put a +1/+1 counter on target creature and it gains indestructible until end of turn. So another card that can save a creature from targeted removal. It has to be something that's going to destroy it or deal damage to it to kill it. But it can save it and leave it with a 1/1 counter, and this can also be a naturalize, and there are a lot of powerful enchantments in this set. There is a cycle of the mythic characters that turn into a creature when they flip over. There is a cycle of shrines that get more powerful the more you have in play. So, Origins of Metal Bending will probably have decent enough targets for the first mode from a bunch of decks. So the fact that it can also save their creature from removal and give it a buff, and the buff is permanent in the form of a 1/1 counter, is also pretty strong. Also, not only does it give the creature indestructible so Heartless Act can't kill it, it also puts a 1/1 counter on it so Heartless Act can't kill it. So they can't even take indestructible away from it for that to work. Next up is Pillar Launch. 1 green, target creature gets +2/+2 and gains reach until end of turn. Untap it. So normally green gets a bigger power and toughness boost than this, but it is only a single green mana and does give other effects. It untaps the creature and allows it to block flyers, so this is one of those, oh hey, you thought you were getting through with your flyer, well, now their creature is big enough to block it and able to do so. So very similar to Yip Yip from before. Except primarily on defense for the whole getting to block your creature thing. It can also, of course, be used to just deal you an extra 2 points of damage if it goes unblocked, or to let their creature win combat and untap it. So, all of those things are factors you need to be aware of, but it's pretty typical for a low casting cost trick. And last thing is Rocky Rebuke, which is 1 in the green, target creature you control deals damage equal to its power to target creature and opponent controls. It is straight up punch that creature. So typical green removal, if you can kill the creature, it will save your guy because they only have the 1 creature punching yours. So good luck with that one. Yeah, it's green removal. It does green removal things. It requires them to have a creature and lets them punch out your guy. It requires them having a big enough creature and lets them punch out your guy. Alright. There are 2 gold cards and they are right next to each other. So Aang Swift Savior is 1 white blue for a 2/3 human avatar ally with flash and flying, and when it enters, airbend up to 1 other target creature or spell, and you can waterbend him for 8 to transform him. So this is very similar to the Oh god, what is the actual name of the thing? It's from Innistrad. It was like the same casting cost Spell Queller. I think its name was Spell Queller, where it would come into play and it would exile the spell off of the stack until it left the battlefield. This one they can obviously cast it again for 2 mana, and if you countered their instant, they'll be able to cast it again for 2 mana immediately if they want to. But it does still make them spend the extra mana. If they don't have it, they don't get to cast their spell until later. So he can be very disruptive in that regard because he's cheap enough that it probably tempos them at least, like makes them not cast the spell now and have to invest more mana to cast it later. He does flip into Ang and La Ocean's Fury. I'm assuming it's La, not like Lay or anything. Which is a 5/5 reach trample, and when it attacks, put a +1/+1 counter on each tapped creature you control. So clearly an angry water spirit with the avatar bound to it. Abandon Attachments is an instant speed lesson for 1 and a hybrid blue-red. You may discard a card. If you do, draw 2 cards. So this is the typical red impulse draw, or not impulse draw, rummage, where you get to cast the spell, discard a card, and draw 2 cards. It can also be played in blue decks, and it is a lesson, so it will be a factor in decks that care about lessons also, regardless of if they are both colors or not, as long as they are one of those 2 colors. So those are literally the only 2 multicolored spells in the main set that meet the requirements. There are 2 colorless cards, and they are not artifacts. There are no flash artifacts or artifacts that can kill multiple things in one turn. Notably, all of these creatures have, to varying degrees, cool effects, but nobody is killing like 3 or 4 creatures at a time, or dealing damage to everything all at once. So none of them actually count for my particular thing. So first of all, energy bending is 2 colorless, or 2 generic rather, for an instant speed lesson. Lands you control gain all basic land types until end of turn, draw a card. It fixes your mana for a turn at the cost of spending 2 mana to filter and draws you a card. It is not a good card, but it is a cantrip and a lesson. So some people might run it just for that, and that might be why they're getting priority. If it is, probably good job you, because being able to cycle it for 2 mana is not the best. It's also not the worst. Like, 2 mana draw a card is already, like, almost borderline, especially when any deck can do it and it can be done at any mana like in any color combination. Like, any 2 mana gets you a free card draw to find your 3rd land. But the other effect is not at all relevant. And our last card from the main set is Zuko's Exile. It is 5 mana for an instant speed lesson. Exile target artifact, creature, or enchantment. Its controller creates a clue token. This is very similar to Introduction to Annihilation from Strixhaven. But whereas that one gave the opponent a card to make up for the fact that you got Intro to Annihilation into your hand as a secondary effect of another spell that you cast, and therefore Intro did not actually cost you a card. This one is costing you a card, but it's 5 colorless mana and instant speed and kills anything. Like, it kills any creature. Like, just straight up exiles the creature, but it can also hit any of the powerful artifacts or enchantments in this set. So its versatility is very high, and the fact that it's entirely colorless means that any deck can run it. So there are going to be decks that would really like one more removal spell that will be happy to have this, especially if they have cards that care about lessons in their deck. So you might see this one a bit more often than you think you would. So that's all of the cards in the set that meet my requirements, but there is a bonus sheet similar to a lot of the other sets we've had. So we'll go over real quick what the cards on the bonus sheet are that are relevant. So brought back is the first one. It is 2 white for an instant. You choose up to 2 target permanent cards in your graveyard that were put there from the battlefield this turn. Return those cards to the battlefield tapped. So this can undo removal spells, get back dead creatures from combat. So if your opponent is throwing creatures with good comes into play abilities into the maws of your creatures, like their 2/2 with a good ETB is attacking, they might be trying to get a little extra value out of their creature dying, or chip in for damage if you don't want to block, since they'll get a benefit either way. Either you'll take extra damage because you don't want to run your guy into a combat trick or something, or you'll block and eat their guys, and then they'll be able to get their guys back and probably get a card's worth of value out of this thing potentially. Next up is Release to Memory. It is 3 and a white for an instant. It exiles target opponent's graveyard, and for each creature card exiled this way, create a 1/1 colorless spirit creature token. So notably, these are not the same spirit tokens from the main set. Those tokens all have an ability that says they can't block or be blocked except by spirits. So this thing makes spirit tokens, but it's themed from Kamigawa. It's from one of the Kamigawa Neon Dynasty commander decks. The white-blue one, obviously. So it's going to exile their graveyard and give you a bunch of 1/1s if they had dead creatures. So this can produce a sudden surge of blockers, including blockers that can actually get in the way of the spirit tokens from the main set. They are still spirits, so they can still block those creatures. But it doesn't do anything if the opponent doesn't have a bunch of dead creatures already. So I have to believe that this one isn't going to see a ton of competitive play, because it's kind of mediocre. It is 4 mana and doesn't do anything until a lot of creatures have traded back and forth. But it does have the potential to make a large number of creatures, so that's not nothing. It's just very unlikely to be a problem. But early on, people are going to try stuff out, so just be aware of this thing. And, if the game has dragged on, this thing becomes a major factor, where your opponent suddenly has like 10 creatures and you have no graveyard anymore. So anything that cared about your graveyard is also gone. Scout's Warning lets you cast a creature at instant speed until end of turn and draws you a card. So it's 1 mana to add flash to one of your creatures in hand and potentially draw that creature if you didn't have one in your hand already. It's a card draw spell, and it gives a creature flash, but if you're already playing around the other creatures in the set with flash, because it's in white, so you do have to worry about things like Appa and the 1/1 that makes 1/1s, then you're already playing around a lot of the more dire things they could probably be throwing at you. Like, just because it's a different giant creature instead of the ones you were playing around doesn't really change anything. And they do still need to be able to cast that giant creature anyway, with the extra mana tacked on to give it flash. Aang's Shelter is Teferi's Protection reskinned. So 2 and a white. Until your next turn, your life total can't change. You gain protection from everything. All of your permanents phase out, and then you exile this card. So this is one of those ones that completely wrecks combat math, but that's about the best it can do. Since your creatures all phase out, they can't use it to, I'm going to block all of your creatures and then yours are going to die and mine are going to live. No, it doesn't do anything like that. So this is entirely a defensive card, but in a close race where your Alpha Strike is supposed to kill them, and now it doesn't, and all of their stuff is safe and secure outside of the game, and then on their turn it will phase back in and be able to attack you, because that's how phasing works. That's going to be brutal. But beyond that, it's just a very wonky fog effect. If you try and burn their face and they suddenly go, oh, I have protection from everything, and my life total can't change, so your 3 damage spell doesn't take me from like 5 to 2 now, and your guys can't hurt me this turn. You know, it does cool things, but it's much better in Commander where you can just nope out of a Wrath effect. It does protect your creatures from Wrath effects by phasing them out and then bringing them back so that they can attack at the beginning. They come back into play at the beginning of your next turn, and it doesn't trigger ETBs. Like, I'm wording this wrong for phasing. When phasing, you treat the cards as though they don't exist while they're phased out. And when they phase in, they start to exist again, but they never actually change zones for the purposes of card effects. Like, they don't trigger leaves the battlefield or enters the battlefield triggers for phasing. And that's an important distinction that newer players might not realize. So I want to make sure I'm clear on that. They're not leaving or entering the battlefield. They just temporarily cease to exist and then spontaneously start existing again. Is how that works. So they don't have summoning sickness, they don't trigger ETBs, none of that. They keep anything that was attached to them too, like they don't lose 1/1 counters when they phase out. Equipment phases out, and equipment and auras phase out with them and stay attached. So you don't get like any kind of real benefit from forcing the opponent to phase out their stuff. So it does get around the wraths in the set. So that might be a thing that you need to worry about when your plan is to wrath. Next up is Force of Negation. So it's a counter spell, but it has the added benefit. It can only counter non-creature spells, but it does have the added benefit of if you are casting it on your opponent's turn, you can exile a blue card from your hand rather than paying the casting cost. It does also exile a spell that gets countered, so if you're countering a lesson, that lesson won't count towards the other effects that care about how many lessons you have in your graveyard. Past that, it's just a counter spell for 3 mana, though. Visions of Beyond is the last blue card. It's an instant that draws a card, or if a graveyard has 20 or more cards in it, you draw 3 instead. That's not really much of a factor in Limited, so it's basically 1 blue to cycle it, like 99% of the time. Moving on to Black. Black gets another Wrath in Black Sun Zenith. So 2 black and X sorcery, put X -1/-1 counters on each creature in play, and shuffle Black Sun Zenith back into its owner's library. So, casting Black Sun Zenith, you have control over how much X is, so you get to decide if it's killing everything, based if you can afford to. Very similar to the other Black Wrath in the set, that has a very similar name, which is probably why they decided this also needed to be on the bonus sheet, but that is not particularly helpful for newer players, or for players who forgot Black Sun Zenith exists and think it's the fancy artwork for the other card. Anyway, so you get to decide, so you will know if your creatures can survive it or not, as long as you can afford to spend the mana. You can kill basically everything, or just their stuff if it's small enough. It is -1/-1 counters, so your things that survive will be permanently reduced in size, but they will also be the survivors in that scenario. Also, if your creatures are all dying and some of theirs are living, at least theirs are living at much smaller power and toughness totals, so that might be enough to, if you can't kill everything, to just go, okay, well, my guys were going to have to chump anyway, so I might as well kill them and put a bunch of counters on your guys, so now your 5/5's a 1/1, and your 6/6 is a 2/2, and I'll just going to have to deal with that now, as best I can, now that I'm only taking 3 damage a turn instead of dying. Yeah, Black Suns is the only relevant black card. Red gets Blasphemous Act, so red and 8 deal 13 damage to each creature. The spell costs 1 less to cast for each creature in play. So when there are 3 creatures in play, this is a 6-drop, and so on. So, yeah, it doesn't take a whole lot of creatures in play for this to suddenly become castable. And the more creatures you commit to the board, the cheaper it's going to be for the opponent to kill all of your stuff. Also, it might be why they're committing creatures to the board is to get, if they can play like, a 2/2 that summons a 1/1 ally, and now the spell costs 2 less, to make it so that the way if you don't cast another creature next turn, they can still cast it for its reduced casting cost. Now it's down to like 5 mana and actually castable on the next turn, even if you don't play any other creatures, and you'll be able to they'll be able to wrath away the board if they needed to. So keep that one in mind. But it's still a wrath. You play around it the way you play around the other wraths. It's just that it has slightly weirder play patterns because of how it changes the casting cost. There's a lot less chump blocking involved if you need to cast Blasphemous Act. I do feel the need to mention Insurrection, despite the fact that it does not kill any creatures, because it tends to just kill players. Insurrection is one of those cards that if you cast it, you will win the game most of the time. In order to not win the game, your opponent has to have a life total higher than the combined power of all creatures in play. So Insurrection is an 8-mana sorcery that untaps all creatures, gains control of them, and gives them haste until end of turn. So you will steal every single creature in play, including your own. So if you cast if you were on 9 or 10 mana and cast a 1 or 2 drop before casting this, you will in fact gain control of all of your creatures as well, and they will gain haste. So you can attack with them on top of that. And yeah, you get to steal everything so your opponent can't block, and you get to deal damage to your opponent equal to the combined power of every single creature in play. And that wins almost every single game. It is that dumb. If you remember Mutinous Massacre from Edge of Eternities, that one was a worse version of this for the most part, and it still won almost every game it got cast in. So Insurrection will do the same. Right next to it is good old-fashioned Lightning Bolt on the bonus sheet, but that's okay. If you get Lightning Bolt, you should take Lightning Bolt and play Lightning Bolt if you're going to be anywhere near red, because it will, in fact, do everything you need it to do. It's the better version of Lightning Strike. It costs half as much mana, does the exact same amount of damage, and can hit any target. So, there is also Rending Volley. Can we load in the rest of the card, please? Thank you. So, for 1 red, it's an instant. It can't be countered. It deals 4 damage to target white or blue creature. It's one of the old color hosing cards from a cycle. It is the only one to make this particular list, and it is a fairly efficient removal spell, but it's entirely sideboard based. Like, best of 1, you probably don't even look at this card as something that you're going to be taking on Arena. Best of 3, however, you might want to consider it because it is a very efficient removal spell. If 1 red deal 3 damage is good, 1 red deal 4 damage is better. Now, granted, this one can't go face, so I would rather have Lightning Bolt in basically every scenario. But, you don't get to choose which one of these you open, and it is not a bad card to have in your sideboard for when you play against the red and white decks. To be able to kill up to a 4 toughness creature for a single mana. And they can interact with it as effectively. They can still buff their creature or give it hexproof, so just because it can't be countered doesn't mean it can't be stopped, but it does have that little bit extra where they can't quench it in the early game if you need to kill their super efficient early white or blue creature. Next to that is Searing Blood. So, 2 red for an instant, deal 2 damage to target creature. If that creature dies this turn, Searing Blood deals 3 damage to that creature's controller. This was an incredibly brutal card back during Theros block. I believe it was in Born of the Gods or Journey into Nyx. You deal 2 damage to a creature, and then when that creature dies, you also deal 3 to its controller. So you get to kill their guy and Lightning Bolt their face. You get to shock their guy and Lightning Bolt their face for the exact same mana cost. and it's stapled to one card. The only caveat is that the creature that you're hitting with the 2 damage has to die, or you don't get the lightning bolt effect. Volcanic Torrent is the last card from red on the list. It's red and 4 for a sorcery. That sorcery has Cascade, so you'll go until you hit a 4-drop or less spell from the top of your deck. You can cast that spell immediately, and if you don't, then you'll put it with the rest of the cards, and all the cards that you revealed, and that card, if you didn't cast it, go to the bottom of your library in a random order. So Volcanic Torrent deals X damage to each creature and planeswalker your opponents control, where X is the number of spells you've cast this turn. The Volcanic Torrent has Cascade, so you will cast the spell it cascades into before it, assuming that you can. And that you want to, because there will be some cards where you hit a card and it's like, well, that requires a target spell on the stack, and I don't want to counterspell my own Volcanic Torrent, so I'll just not cast it. That type of thing. Or it requires creature I control as a target, and I currently don't have any creatures, that's why I'm trying to kill everything. But past all of that, it's most likely going to deal 2 damage. More than that if you can cast any other spells ahead of it. As the last red card. The green cards are, let's see, Heroic Intervention is the first one. So 1 in the green, permanents you control gain hexproof and indestructible until end of turn. Very popular commander card, so gets reprinted a bunch. It will save the opponent's stuff from all of your removal. It will stop their things from dying in combat. It is a potentially very brutal card if the race is close, because they will get to keep all of their stuff and you will still lose some of your stuff to just about everything. It stops the destruction effects. Notably, though, that one black spell does get around it because it will remove the hexproof and indestructible from the affected creatures. And so will Black Sun Zenith for that matter, because it's -1/-1 counters, and it doesn't target. But it will save creatures from things like the Destined Confrontation and whatnot, so it is still a thing you have to be aware of, and it will still save things from dying to combat damage. So. And it can be used to blank your targeted removal spells also. Like, you go to kill something and they're like, Heroic Intervention. By the way, my other stuff is also hexproof and indestructible too. Earth Rumble Triumph is a reskin of Return of the Wild Speaker. So for 4 in the green, you choose 1. You either draw cards equal to the Grave's power among non-human creatures you control, or non-human creatures you control get +3/+3 until end of turn. So this one is potentially very brutal, except for the fact that most of the creatures in this set are humans. There are a lot of humans in this set. Almost every creature in this set is a human. The only exceptions are the weird mutant animals that are like hybrids of like 2 different things, and one thing that is just a bear. I guess technically your Sky Bison friend is only a bison, but he has 6 legs and flies, so he still counts as a weird mutant as far as I'm concerned. Not that there's anything wrong with that. Sometimes it can be cool to be a weird mutant. And that leaves us with, just Lifelong Friendship. So this is a reskin of Aladmari's Call. It is white and a green for an instant, and it tutors a creature. So, very similar to card draw. The only weird thing about this one is if they have a creature with flash they can tutor, that will become a factor. But that just means there's tacking on extra 2 mana to that creature. So if you were playing around that creature anyway, you're playing around this one. Alright, so that is all of the cards from both the main set and the bonus sheet that fall into the category of instance, spells with flash, and wrath effects. So, like I said, doing these things does help me. early on, I tend to do a lot better than I do once the format is very well established and everybody knows what they're doing. Because I am a little bit more prepared for the cards that will have the biggest impact on whether or not I can win a game of Magic. A lot of times it's just knowing what your opponent can do and not just blindly walking into it. If you walk into it, it should be because you have a plan or because you know it's a possibility, but you can't win the game if they have it, so you just have to keep playing anyway. Like, those are the only times where you can know it's coming and still get beaten by it. But you do your best and you win a lot more games if you know what they can do. So I find these things to be very helpful to me. I hope they're helpful to you as well. If they are, please let me know in the comment section. I do one of these every time a new set comes out, and they are some of my highest viewed videos, but that's because people are looking for information on the set going into the pre-release, and I do think this is some of the most relevant information you can have going into the pre-release. If you know what these cards are and you don't get ambushed by them, you're going to win a lot more games that you should have lost when you didn't know about them. And I really do think it helps me play better at the pre-release and for the first couple weeks of the set. So I hope it helps you too, and I wish you luck at the pre-release. So thank you for watching, and I will see you next time. Have a good rest of your day.